we're focused on seeing those investments move forward. Within our domain of public transit, we're talking about making sure that, for example, there's backup forms of generation. I don't mean diesel generation. Backup means of electricity generation for our transition to zero emission technologies. Under the acknowledgement that if we're facing drought, if we're facing instances where we're going to have rolling blackouts, and we want to transition to zero emission technologies to combat climate change in the long term and deliver cleaner benefits today, that we don't allow for climate changes happening today to ultimately down our fleet by not giving us the ability to charge our fleet and to provide the mobility services that we provide on the bus space, primarily to low-income people.
So another aspect of your work is air quality work.
Yeah.
How difficult is that type of work?
I would say for me, it is probably half of the work that I do for the association is focused on really this transition to cleaner technologies and cleaning the air. You know, the work there is challenging because it is a balancing act between the goals and targets and the practical limitations of where we are as a society. But
most people don't immediately connect transportation and infrastructure with wealth building. But as you will hear in this episode, they play a crucial role in creating economic opportunities and improving the quality of life, especially in marginalized communities. My name is Papaya Aquino. I'm the host of the GWP podcast. We have an incredibly insightful conversation lined up for you with Michael Pimentel, the current executive director of the California Transit Association. I mean, who better to talk to about how transportation relates to wealth building than Michael? Michael has been recognized as the Transportation Advocate of the Year, an award I personally saw him receive. And he was named in the 2023 Mass Transit 40 Under 40. And so in this episode, we dive into the significance of transportation and its role in promoting sustainable development and economic opportunities. Look, Michael is an expert in this field, so you will enjoy this conversation. He shares his journey and his background, including how he found himself on President Obama's campaign. We also discussed the challenges and opportunities in achieving zero emission by 2050, an initiative put in place by President Biden, and the impact of the California's HighSpeed rail project. I mean, we're connecting people from San Francisco to San Diego. Imagine the economic opportunities in between the two and how it affects your financial freedom. So if you're ready, as much as I am, buckle up and let's dive in. Wow. I'm super excited for this episode, man. I don't know if you could tell, but been looking forward to this. Oh, man. Michael Pimentel, welcome to GWP.
Thank you, Papa, for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, it's a beautiful Sunday. And, you know, you've taken your time out to come here and speak to us. I really appreciate it. The first time I met you, you were receiving an award. And as usual, when people receive an award, they have a little speech that they give. And your speech, I heard it and I was like, man, you're well-spoken. I loved that. And the topics you spoke about, I was like, that's of interest for me on GWP. So I'm really appreciative that you came on today to speak to us.
I really appreciate the invitation. Coming down to San Francisco is hardly a hard sell for me. So thank you for hosting.
Yeah, of course. So a lot of the work you do relates to transportation. Yeah. It's something that you're really passionate about. And so when I speak of the award that you received, it was the Advocate of the Year. And so it seems like a lot of the work you do has to do with advocating for transportation, but there's so many aspects of transportation. At least for me, when I think about it, that's kind of what gives me access to opportunity, right? Which is to my job. I need that transportation to be able to get to my job. And through that, I'm able to make money, build wealth, and hopefully live the life that I want. I'm sure a lot of people can relate that way. How important is transportation in our lives?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely central to virtually all aspects of what it means to be a a human in this society. I think, Papa, you touched on one of them, which is just access to opportunity. I think about my own story when I think about what public transit can mean for communities across the state. I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad, and my primary means of getting to class, getting to summer jobs, to internships, all flowed through AC Transit, SF Muni, and the Capitol Corridor. And for that, it meant that I was able to have the ability to interface, interact with, folks that were going to be able to provide opportunities for me over the long term. And that ultimately has led me to a position of being able to make change for others. And so for me, it's personal and it's important for us on that level. But I'd also scope up and just talk about generally what we found in research. There's a great economist out of Harvard who has written quite a lot about the primary determinants of folks getting out of poverty. His name is Raj Chetty. And he has found that the single biggest indicator of folks who get out of poverty and those who don't is your commute time. And that is a story about folks who have access to cars versus those who don't. But it's also a story about those who have access to high quality public transit and those who don't. And so for me, I can speak to my personal story, what it's meant to me for my ability to engage in this society. But the research is also clear. Without these types of investments in transportation and services and infrastructure, many folks are going to be held down. Now, I'd want to maybe scope from outside of that perspective as well on the economic opportunity front and bridge into health and also air quality. And here, we know in the state of California that transportation is the single largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. And with that often comes to things like particulate emissions that have impacts on health, have impacts on life expectancy, et cetera. And for us to be in a position to be able to improve outcomes, health outcomes to folks, one, you need access to healthcare, and that's afforded by having direct linkages, public transit or automobile. But then also want to make sure that we're cleaning the air, and public transit plays a big part in that, moving people out of single occupancy cars into high capacity transit that has generally on a per capita basis lower emissions than single occupancy travel. But as we migrate toward cleaner technologies in the public transit space, much like we're starting to see in the automobile space, it means that we'll get kind of a twofer. Decreases in emissions as a result of what we call mode shift in our industry, movement away from cars into high capacity public transit, but then also too, the emission reductions that come from moving to a cleaner technology that has zero tailpipe emissions.
And now, the one thing, when successful people give credit to hard work for their success, what do they really mean? While hard work is essential, it is not the only factor for success. Other elements such as talent, opportunity, timing, and luck play a significant role, but let's focus on factors of hard work. Number one is consistency and persistence. Look, hard work means consistently putting in the effort over a long period, even when faced with challenges, setbacks, or the lack of immediate results. It's the persistence to keep going when things get really tough. Remember, anything that's good is going to be really hard to get, so you need to be persistent. Number two is focused and purposeful effort. Hard work is not just about the number of hours you put in, but the quality of those hours. It involves working smart, focusing on high impact tasks, and setting clear goals. Also, consistently evaluating and improving your approach. If it's not working, adapt. We might say pivot. Next is discipline and sacrifice. Hard work often requires discipline, which means making sacrifices. This could be sacrificing leisure time like hanging out with friends, comfort, or immediate results for a reward, which is a long term. It means prioritizing tasks and staying committed to your plans. Keep listening for the final and a bonus point.
Yeah, man, there's a lot to unpack there.
A lot.
One of the things you mentioned is your personal story, which I think we should shift into, right? So currently you're the executive director for the California Transportation Association.
That's right.
That's a big role, right? You're advocating for all of transportation in California. And one of the things I was reading about was the recent budget that Governor Newsom released, which due to the work that you've been doing with your advocacy, you were able to secure about 5.1 billion for, critical transportation projects that's much needed. Tell us more about your work as the executive director. I mean, how did you get there, and where's the passion coming from to, advocate for transportation, something so important? I feel like we don't think about it so much, right? Because I wake up every morning, check what time the train is coming, and I just show up and I get on the train, right? But there are people like you that are advocates and fighting at the legislative level, local level, government level, wherever, just to make sure we get access to these services that we're not sometimes too thankful for.
Yeah. So I think the story of my background, before I shift into more particularly the role that I play at the Transit Association, harken back to my childhood. I grew up in East LA, large Mexican family, 7 Theos and Theas on both sides of my family, and 14 Theos and Theas in total, not to mention countless cousins. I mean, quite literally countless cousins. And, with that, the neighborhood itself, generally impoverished, generally surrounded by freeways on all sides. And in the 90s, it was pretty typical in Los Angeles. You'd walk out, you couldn't see downtown LA. The air was a bit smoggy. They'd have, episodes where they would tell folks, okay, now you as kids, you as people should not be outdoors exercising, et cetera, because there's some potential health impacts to your being outside. Now, when I think about that experience, I'll be candid. My family within my broader family, I mean, my nuclear family within my broader family was slightly better off, and came to be much better off as time went on. But it did, interacting with my Theos and Theas, all my cousins, did provide me with some exposure to some of the hardships with regards to not just the air quality impacts, because they were real in my family. Cousins had asthma, grandma who had lung disease, not because they did anything that was self-inflicted. They were simply just living their lives in the neighborhood that they grew up in, the neighborhood that, due to economic opportunities, was what was available to them. And so I saw a bit of that. I also saw that for my grandparents, when they needed to go someplace and needed to get to a doctor, they often would call our local paratransit service called Access Services. They come and provide them a ride. It's often referred to as dial-a-ride service. And that was just so critical for them. In the absence of that type of service being available, they wouldn't have been able to get the medical treatment that they needed. Those who were caretakers for them generally didn't have access to reliable automobiles. Certainly they had cars, but not always reliable. And given the health limitations of my grandma, you needed to be able to have a wheelchair and bring her to and from the health facilities. And so there's a bit of that. But I'd also want to recognize and acknowledge that I completed college in 2010. It was not the height of the Great Recession, but we were still kind of cresting at that Great Recession. And I had studied economics as an undergrad, spent a lot of my time studying what I would refer to as Depression era economics, trying to really understand, when the bottom falls out from an economy, how do you go about making improvements to that economy to get people back to work, ultimately drive wealth and economic activity in order for there to be a better position for people across the nation. And as I graduated, it was very much the experience that I think a lot of millennials who graduated into Great Recession found themselves in. Jobs were few. You would send in applications. You'd be lucky if you heard back. The jobs that were generally offered had low starting pay. And that is something that we know. You get lower starting pay that can stick with you for a lifetime and depress your lifetime earnings. And so for me, I was thinking through, okay, what type of space could I get involved in that maybe starts to make a difference? And I started to see infrastructure development as being one area that I was interested in getting involved in. Because if you go back to the Great Depression, one of the things that got us out of that Great Depression was tremendous investment in public infrastructure. A lot of that driven by Franklin Roosevelt, a lot of it driven by the various rounds of economic stimulus that he passed, but then also too, the economic stimulus that came about from World War II and the Make Jobs programs that were established there. And so I started to see, okay, if we're going to get out of this thing, Great Recession, not as bad by any stretch as the Great Depression, we're probably going to have to do a bit more investment in infrastructure. And luckily, President Obama had been elected in 2008. He took the reins of the White House in 2009. And one of the first things he turned to was the playbook from the Great Depression in building out what became the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Now, I feel very privileged to have almost had a front row seat to the development of that package. The professor I was working under at the time was formerly a member of the Clinton administration. His close colleague within our economic department was a woman by the name of Christina Romer. And Christina Romer ultimately became the head of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. They remained in contact, my professor and Professor Romer. And so as the package was being developed, we would hear from my professors, a gentleman by the name of Brad DeLong, about how things were going, what the considerations were. And he would posit to us, you as my economic students, where are they getting things wrong? Where are they getting things right? And so we would have, a bit of rapport about this. And so I give all that history because there's almost a marriage that takes place. This interest in this particular moment in time that I'm in, Great Recession, lack of opportunity, not just for myself, but for people across the nation, my own personal experience growing up. And I came to say, you know what, maybe transit or transportation infrastructure is it. I get the access and the health justice aspects of it, but then also to the economic aspects of it. And that's where I started my career. And so to maybe play out a bit further before I touch on the association in particular, I started working for Jerry Brown. He was in downtown Oakland starting his campaign. He was then Attorney General, but wanting to return to Sacramento for the second time for what would be the start of a third term, and just happened to send his campaign a rogue note. It had no other access point to them outside of the info at Jerry Brown for governor.gov or whatever it was, and just sent them a few of my observations of things that I hoped that they would be addressing, areas where I would be interested in getting involved if there were opportunities. And I got a call just one day.
So you just send him an email?
Campaign and an email. Wow. And campaign staffer reached out and said, we have some opportunities. They're unpaid, in essence, full-time jobs. Can you try with us for a few months? And so I did. And I'll be honest, I stepped in at the most junior role. It wasn't quite stuffing envelopes. It wasn't too much more glamorous than that.
Were you grabbing the coffee and stuff?
Yeah, I was doing a bit of vetting, for research proposals and doing some, deep dives in some of his history for, purposes of fielding off what could be opposition research takes against the governor. And it was useful, though, for getting my foot in the door. Now, of course, he ended up getting elected in November of 2010. And I had the opportunity to sit down with his wife, who was a high-level confidant within the campaign, a high-level staffer within the campaign, and by her own right, hugely successful, hugely capable woman named Ann Gus Brown, formerly, I believe, chief legal counsel for the Gap Corporation. And we had conversation around, if there were jobs that were available in the administration, what would I be interested in getting into? Where could I fit in? And so we talked a bit about what we just covered, my experience in economics, my personal background, my interest in getting into policy, and that really started my career in earnest. Got a call back. I think it was quite literally, December 26th, saying, "Can you be in Sacramento by January 3rd?" And so whatever plans I had for the holidays, I set them aside, went on Craigslist. I found myself an apartment, and sight unseen, not really been to Sacramento previously. I moved to Sacramento and started what became a 4-year stint. So first 4 years of his eventual third and fourth term working for the administration. And so, that's how I got into the space, what motivated me, what kept me, grounded as I was really starting my career. But these days, as you mentioned, Papa, I'm the executive director of the California Transit Association. I stepped into this role in 2021, so I'm now, several years in. And I had spent quite a few times staffing the association as a deputy executive director, and then previously as an advocate, and had been with them for about 9 years. And the work that we do is really centered on how do we make public transit a more competitive mode in the state of California. And that is a conversation about funding resources, kind of balancing away from what has been historic investment in really highways, streets and roads, and a little bit of public transit, to a greater investment in public transit to move systems forward. And by that, I mean major capital projects, but then also to operations, making sure that not only are you building a new train or you're building a new bus rapid transit system, but you actually have service levels that are there that mean something impactful to the people that, in theory, these systems are benefiting. And so the work that we did on the budget, it was a challenge. And as you mentioned, it ultimately resulted in a $5.1 billion package that will be provided to transit agencies across the state, and I should say communities across the state, over a 4-year time horizon. But that was necessary because in the absence of that package, we would have seen something very devastating in California, which was rescission of transit service, scaling back to fewer hours in the day, less frequent service, some bus lines, some rail lines stopping in total because of the COVID-19 pandemic. When the pandemic happened, we saw ridership across the nation drop by over 80%. And within that 80% average are some agencies that experience even greater decreases. BART, Caltrain, both here in San Francisco, saw decreases of over 90%. And for those systems, their draw from the fare box, what we all pay when we hop on BART, accounts ultimately for 60 to 70% of their operating budget. 90% decrease in essence, your income, you can't keep up your expenses. Now, we were able to, over the life of the pandemic, draw down some significant resources from the federal government. Ultimately, that totaled $10 billion and kept the agencies afloat. But no one had anticipated when the pandemic started that would take 3 years for things to really start to wind down. And so those resources were mismatched with the long-term need. And that's where the state investment stepped in, and why it was so critical that we did the work that we did to bring those resources online, keep services afloat.
Yeah, man, That's such important work. And do you think, I guess, like some of that inspiration or the skills that you needed came from studying economics, what you call the crisis economics? Did you get some of that inspiration from there to be able to respond and rise to the challenge? Because, we're talking about COVID-19, right? No one knew what to do. No one knew what was going on. How did you come to be the point person and respond? Because you took your role in 2021, which was almost like at the height of the pandemic, right? So, how do you step in there to say, okay, let's go, we're going to go get this 10 billion from the government to be able to keep these services afloat. This is what the community needs. Like, how did you make those sort of like strategy decisions?
Yeah. So I would say that, the acumen and the ability to carry that conversation, which, to be clear, had many parties, right? I was central in helping to drive the campaign forward, but there were so many other voices who were involved, both from within my association, but also externally, including here in the Bay Area. But what I would credit quite a lot is, one, yes, the education, but I would say maybe less on the subject matter front and more of, the experience of very rigorous education, both undergrad and grad school that I found myself in, just the level of workload, the level of synthesis that needs to take place when you're going through, pretty intense programs. I think that gave me the work ethic to be able to manage what were ultimately long days and many long conversations. But I think probably what benefited me the most in helping to navigate those waters was the experience that I had working for the association. And so this is an association that is set up to represent transportation interest across the board. Public transit agencies, transportation authorities, manufacturers, parts suppliers, regional entities. And then increasingly, we're building out relationships with environmental justice groups, labor organizations to, again, represent a broad swath of transportation interest. And in that work, what is central is working to find consensus and working to find consensus amongst disparate viewpoints, and oftentimes when the opportunities before us are fairly limited. And so I've done work in the past that really needs to thread the needle, just recognizing few options forward, many opinions. How do you find something that can thread that needle of finding that position of going through that one option that's available, but considering all opinions that are on the table? And so having done that work previously, I think now that we were presented with a slightly distinct challenge of a public health crisis and the economic fallout that resulted from that, I was able to lean on that skill set and what I had learned through the process in navigating regulations and legislation, and to apply it here, different topic, same general background and familiarity to carry us forward.
Yeah. Wow. So amazing. And what about, let's shift into climate, right? Climate change a little bit. I feel like a lot of the work you do also covers that aspect, right? Which is the climate change piece. Currently, we're in a very tough time in our world today. I think everywhere in the world, right? There's a lot going on. But zeroing in on climate change specifically, California, for example, we've been getting a lot of rain, right? A lot of places are affected more than other places. And so some of these areas are already sort of like marginalized areas, and then they get hit with these like serious droughts and so on. It takes them much longer to actually recover than other communities. How is your work addressing some of these challenges right now?
So I think there are a number of ways in which we're working to address the challenges. Just to be clear, there's much more work to be done on this front. But I think primarily it starts with funding and directing the funding to the communities that are going to be most in need. And so we spend a lot of time as an association standing up programs in concert with the legislature and with various administrations from Schwarzenegger on through Newsom, that ensures that we have ongoing monies from the state's primary program to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions that get directed toward one, public transit, and then two, what we call in the state of California, disadvantaged communities. And so to offer the highest level perspective, under state policy, there's a program called Cap and Trade. Cap and Trade puts a price on carbon that any polluter has to pay in order to continue to do business here in California. And the central premise of Cap and Trade is by creating a cap, one, you can use the monies that are generated to make investments that offset the emissions impact, greenhouse gas, but also particulate emissions, and also through the function of Cap and Trade that has a ratcheting down system, squeeze emissions out of the system. And the central premise is if at some point the cap has come down so much, the emissions have been pressed out, companies will no longer be emitting at the levels that they once were. And the idea is that in theory, we could squeeze out emissions from the state of California in total. Now, within the Cap and Trade system, the monies that are generated get deposited in what we call a greenhouse gas reduction fund. That fund gets then applied to a variety of purposes pursuant to the legislature's current plan. And we fought to establish the current plan, which has 10% of all the credits that are generated and the value of the credits that are generated in a given year being directed toward transportation infrastructure. And here I should say public transit infrastructure, rail and bus. And then 5% goes toward operations. Within that same structure, though, there are targets that are set out for investments that need to be made, thresholds that need to be made for low-income communities and disadvantaged communities to right what are historic injustices for these communities. It could be East LA, where I grew up. It could be South Sacramento. It could be Bayview, Hunters Point. It could be any number of places in the state of California to make sure that we are delivering improved outcomes for those communities as we are making investments to move us toward a cleaner California economy. And so we as an association have done a lot of work in helping to drive those programs forward, both in the investments and then shaping what ultimately become those breakdowns of investments in disadvantaged communities. The other area, though, that we've been really centrally focused on is making sure that we are investing in the transition to zero emission technologies. And so over the last decade, we as an association have helped inform the development of and ultimately implementation of regulations to transition us to 100% zero emission technologies on all public transit platforms, bus, rail, and ferry. And part of that transition too is thinking through how do we make sure that we front load those investments in areas that have had the most historic experiences with poor air quality, or they haven't had necessarily access to cleaner technologies, and make sure that we're applying those dollars there first. But you asked, I think, a general question about resiliency. You know, what I spoke to is greenhouse gas emission reduction. That's about kind of the long term. How can we maybe prevent climate change from happening? The reality is climate change is happening today as well. And so much of that work is now centrally focused on, for our association, implementation of President Biden's Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as the state legislature and Governor Newsom's last two rounds of budget investments, where there is, for the first time between those two bills or two packages, investments in climate resiliency. And here we're talking about infrastructure hardening, primarily in those areas where, yes, the experiences are going to be most severe from climate change, but two, where those impacts of climate change are going to be most severe for communities that have historically been left by the wayside. And so we're focused on seeing those investments move forward. Within our domain of public transit, we're talking about making sure that, for example, there's backup forms of generation. And I don't mean diesel generation, but backup means of electricity generation for our transition to zero emission technologies, under the acknowledgement that if we're facing drought, if we're facing instances where we're going to have rolling blackouts, and we want to transition to zero emission technologies to combat climate change in the long term and deliver cleaner benefits today, that we don't allow for climate changes happening today to ultimately down our fleet by not giving us the ability to charge our fleet and to provide the mobility services that we provide on the bus space, primarily to low-income people. But also, we're looking at areas around infrastructure hardening for subterranean rail stations. Here in San Francisco, I think you've got the clearest examples of them. Muni and BART along the Embarcadero are going to be challenged in the years ahead, particularly as we see sea level rise.
Yeah.
In the absence of investments to create new sea walls, make further improvements to those subway stops, we might see that there's going to be some impact from those waters that ultimately down critical linkage for communities across the Bay Area. And so those are some of the areas where we are focused as an association, in areas where in the years ahead, particularly as we see investments move forward from the IIJA, that's President Biden's bill, and the budget acts from the legislature and Governor Newsom, we're going to be centrally focused.
Yeah. So, I mean, climate change, zero emission sounds like a huge task though, right? We're talking about less, almost like zero carbon in the atmospheres and some of these cars that we drive, the equipment, the appliances that we use. And I think, is it 2050 Biden's proposal, or
That's
is it
right
2050? So we're projecting by 2050 to zero emission. What are some of the challenges you've seen already, or what are some of the challenges that we're going to encounter along the way? Yeah. And if someone is listening to this podcast, how can we contribute to maybe cut back that 2050 to, if possible, 2040? I don't know, but make it more sooner, right? Because some of these like marginalized communities that we're talking about, sounds like they're going to be struggling until we get there, right? So what can we as people that are listening right now do to help maybe curb the problem that we have? Yeah.
So quite a few challenges, and I'll speak with a lot of firsthand experience from the work that we've done in the public transit sector. I would say first off, the biggest issue that we face is funding. Now that's something that unfortunately is hard to navigate around. We just simply need more investment in transportation, infrastructure that is zero emission in order to meet ultimately these zero emission targets. But setting funding aside, because it is such a difficult issue to address absent there being changes in the US Congress that afford investments at a higher level in zero emission technologies, there are some very practical concerns that I would flag on the ground that I think many are going to experience as they transition to zero emission technologies. The first is related to our utility companies. And the reality is that our utility companies don't at this stage have the capacity to meet what is a growing need for infrastructure to support a zero emission economy. On the public transit end, that means that agencies that today may call up PG&E or SCE and say, we need support building out a substation to provide power to a depot to charge a bus, may see a lead time of anywhere between 24 and 48 months. That means that your plan to introduce zero emission technologies, even if you have every dollar in hand for the infrastructure and for the vehicles, is put on hold until you can find your place in the queue to actually see that work done by the utility companies.
Why is that going on?
This is, to be candid, not an instance where I'd want to vilify the companies at all. This is a matter of limitations in workforce, limitations in the infrastructure components and supplies that they need to carry out the work that are themselves a function of a tight labor market, which has made it hard to find the necessary workforce at costs that the companies can afford, but also two, a lack of the supply chain that's necessary to build these components and supplies at scale. And so they too are constrained in even being able to ramp up if they so chose. Now, there's legislation that was passed last year that looks to address some of that. And at this point, it remains to be seen whether or not it will fully solve the issue, but certainly it may make some inroads into the issue. And without going into too much of the technical jargon, in essence, what it will allow for these companies to do is to begin to make investments prospectively to meet what they anticipate needs to be for the zero emission transition with a longer lead time. Today, the companies are constrained with, in essence, stockpiling supplies for the zero emission transition to be reflective only to the demand that they know that they have. With the change in California law, no longer are they only set to make those investment decisions in componentry based on what they have in hand, but rather they can look prospectively to what might be and start to make some decisions there to, in essence, stockpile those components, allow them to scale up at the appropriate times. And so that's one issue that I would flag. I think the other big issue that we face, and we touched on this a bit just a second ago, is the resiliency conversation. The reality is that our grid as a whole, and this is separate from investments in building out new charging or refueling infrastructure for a transit agency or an Amazon. The reality is the grid does not have the ability to absorb all the new demand that is being placed on it. And we experience this already today in instances where we are having a heat wave. Everyone in the state, provided you have it, have their AC on, and we experience rolling blackouts. Rolling blackouts are actuated by the utility companies when there's an imbalance between the demand and the supply of electricity. And what they try to do is manage the demand so that the supply is available to be directed toward often critical facilities and critical infrastructure. You wouldn't want a hospital, for example, to lose electricity, but you might be more okay with an apartment building.
Yeah.
It's electricity going down, right? So they make those elective decisions. As we move forward, though, on zero emission transition, particularly on the vehicle end, and we say, okay, you public transit agency, you Amazon, you port goods logistics company, move forward in zero emission transition. If you as a company or an organization are faced with the potential threat that your services or your primary function as an organization is going to be set aside for a period of time because of rolling blackouts, you may be disinclined to move forward in zero emission transition because it cuts at your profit motive. It cuts at your ability to provide often core and essential services. And so you may slow walk the transition. And so as we consider what is going to be a transition to zero emission technologies, we've got to be thinking about the climate resiliency piece as well. How are we building out some redundancy to the grid and making sure that we have that in place so that folks aren't able to point to the challenges with the grid as being a reason for not transitioning to zero emission technologies. Now, Papa, you did ask about things that folks can be doing today to help address climate change. I'd say first and foremost, ride public transit. The reality is in the state of California, 40% of our emissions as a state derive from the transportation sector. Not all of that speaks to single occupancy vehicles and public transit. A lot of it is from goods movement and logistics, but a lot can be reduced if folks just swapped out 1 or 2 car rides a week for a ride on your local bus, a ride on your local rail system. I would say it would be ideal if that vehicle were zero emission, but even if it's not, again, on a per capita, per user basis, the emissions profile is lower. We need folks to start bringing that into their routine and considering what they can do to contribute to what is, again, the largest source of emissions in the state.
Yeah. I love how you bring that up because the next thing I wanted to talk about was building wealth. And I'm trying to figure out how what you just talked about can connect to building wealth. But the way I'm thinking about it is if I'm riding public transportation, generally I should be saving some money also. Not only am I saving some money, but I'm also contributing to my community, right? And, you get the transportation running and other, riders, workers who are, public transportation reliant can have these services running also. Do you see a link there though? Whether it's like, building wealth and transit, or the quality of transit, the quality of the infrastructure, some of these legislature that you work so hard on. Do you often maybe think about building wealth and some of the work that you do, how the two can collide?
Yeah, I would say that very much there is a link between running public transit and the infrastructure investments and what is wealth generation for individuals and for the state or economy as a whole. On the individual level, I think you touched on it quite well. The reality is that the average bus pass about $100 a month. I couldn't give you the exact figure for what it costs to own a car, have insurance, pay for gas or electricity, but I would stipulate it's several multiples more than that. And the reality is that is contemplating a vehicle that is well functioning. And so, public transit does provide that savings in your wallet, but it also does afford, to your question around, investments that could be made, or writing public transit, what it means for our community members, the fact that we could invest, right, by saying yes to local revenue generation for public transit. Oftentimes sales taxes are on the ballot, or parcel tax, property taxes are on the ballot. Saying yes to that, even if you yourself are not riding public transit every day, does have meaningful impacts on folks because it can help keep fares low. It can also help create higher quality service, which, to call back to how we started the podcast and my acknowledgement and shout out to the Harvard professor Raj Chetty, we just know quality of service matters. The difference between having a bus that comes on time every day and gets you to work at a set time is, for some people, the difference between holding a job or not. And so for us, I think it's imperative. I think it's a moral imperative that we make sure that as we are making investments in infrastructure, that we're thinking through, how does this infrastructure work for all people? As we're making investments as a society, that we're thinking through what is going to be that experience to the end user. So I think those are some of the ways in which, at the individual level, it matters. I think on the broader economic level, we have to think about multiplier effects. You make $1 of investment in public transit, per the research from our partners at the American Public Transportation Association, that can have a 4 to 5 times multiplier on the investment. And what that means is you're making $1 of investment in the infrastructure. That's a job in theory, or an investment in some form of component, concrete, rail, telecom, etc. And that too creates some form of economic activity for someone.
Yeah.
And we have multiplier effects that get applied to that throughout the economy, and it ripples. And so, while I couldn't speak for what it means, at a super granular level, without a doubt, the economic research is clear. Investment in transit, investment in transportation infrastructure has numerous benefits on the economic end. We can also take into account the health benefits, which ought to be considered when we are talking about the investments and their impact, by way of limiting asthma risk, limiting cancer risk. All of that are potentially defrayed costs that we as society would otherwise bear, that can be used, that investment is otherwise freed up to be made in something else. And so those are some of the things that I think about when we talk about public transit and ways in which it benefits the individual, but then the economy as a whole.
Back to the one thing on this episode. Next is learning and adaptation. Hard work involves continuous learning and the ability to adapt, as I said before. It's about being open to feedback and learning from failures, and being willing to adjust your strategies. This growth mindset is crucial to overcoming obstacles and improving performance. Athletes often use coaches and receive their feedback to continuously improve. Thank you for listening to this episode of GWP.
Yeah, and it's so interconnected. And one of the issues that you've kind of already mentioned is, for example, these utility companies, one of the issues that they face is the lack of scale or personnel, right, to be able to speed up these innovations to get us to where we want to be. Transportation might probably not be, someone listening to this podcast might not think about transportation as, the career that they may yearn for, right? We're here in San Francisco. People are probably looking at tech and some of these, whatever, sexy jobs that they may be going after. But there's critical need in transportation, and there's so much opportunity over there also. So if someone is listening right now and maybe they haven't thought about transportation as a field that they could be diving into, what would you tell them?
I would tell them it's multifaceted. If you care about the environment, if you care about public health, if you care about the communities that you live in, then you ought to be giving consideration to, and here I'll pitch it, with more granularity, public transit sector as being one area to start your job, because the reality is that public transit in this nation, but also too globally, is often at the vanguard of adopting new technology. On the zero emission front, we were the first sector here in the state of California to have 100% zero emission mandate applied to us, and that we supported. And we are moving forward with the largest deployment of zero emission technologies of any sector in the state and the nation with these zero emission technologies. And so there's a lot to be said there. But talking about and understanding and internalizing the co-benefits that these investments bring on the health front, on the economic front, too, should be motivating. Now, I would say that for me, I also think through set aside what may be white collar workers and what the interest and motivation would be for them. There are also some clear benefits, many of them the same, but for your average blue collar worker. We're talking about a field that is heavily unionized, that comes with life-sustaining, fair wages, healthcare benefits for you and your family, and provides you with an ability to have clear impact on the communities that you are providing service to. And so that too, I think, should be compelling. So across the spectrum, no matter what your background is, no matter what your level of education is, there is a role for you at a public transit agency. And it's something that I think is of critical importance for one other reason. And that is that as we think through the future of public transit in the state, and we think about the recovery for the agencies, the reality is that we are not past the long shadow of the pandemic on our ridership. One of the chief impediments to getting our service up, and therefore our riders up, is lack of workforce. And that is something we're going to have to address in the near term if we're actually going to see this industry recover. And so again, there's a place somewhere at our agencies for anyone, no matter your background.
Yeah, I love that. And so another thing I want to shift into, you've done so much work in the transportation sector. What are some of the, insights or some of the research or information that you've uncovered that most people don't know, but it's really surprising?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say, first off, on the transportation end, or public transit end in particular, I think it is just what a meaningful impact our services mean for our communities. And here I'm setting aside the services and talking about things that we mobilize and do, often without much fanfare, often in the cover of night, but that actually means something big for our communities. I think the clearest example of this has been the recent spat of natural disasters that we've had across the state of California, with floods, with wildfires. Stepping into the field, I had no knowledge that public transit is often mobilized as a first responder for doing evacuations from areas that are facing some challenge. And it has been something that I've observed throughout my industry as a point of pride for a lot of the agency heads, for a lot of their workforce, knowing that not only are they providing the services day to day, but that when disaster strikes, they're there. And I've had conversations with folks who led the teams to do evacuations for wildfires in Santa Rosa and in Paradise and in Napa, who just understand that in the absence of their services, the state has no other at-scale means of doing this type of work. So that much has been interesting and compelling. I think the other area that has caught me by surprise is something I learned not from research, but rather from the pandemic. And that was the role that we played in providing things like meals to folks during the height of the pandemic. So one of the things that was an interesting deviation from what we would typically do is, I mentioned at the start of this conversation, the fact that my grandmother relied on dial-a-ride service. Now, at the height of the pandemic, fewer people were traveling. And so fewer people had to call on dial-a-ride service because maybe they weren't going to that recreational activity, or they weren't going to the grocery store. Maybe they're ordering groceries or having someone drop them off. But for those people who maybe didn't have the means to simply order their things, public transit stepped up and actually helped deliver groceries, Meals on Wheels to folks who needed it. And that much is, I think, something that I would hope all people come to understand, that we aren't just simply mobility providers, and we are fully ingrained in our communities and in our society in ways that are untold. And so this is something I'd want to uplift for your listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. That's so inspiring, especially, right now with all the natural disasters and everything going on. It's sometimes when some of these things happen. I think the other day I was on Instagram and the flooding had happened in San Diego. And some of the comments that were coming in was just like some of these like negative comments against California and, the state is doomed, blah, blah, blah. It was just so dark. And I'm reading that. I'm like, it's so tough to be reading that on the internet, right? Something so drastic is happening to everyone in the state. And it's not like, if you're in Michigan, it's not like you're immune to this kind of stuff. This is like natural disasters. Like they just happen. You have no control over. And people will make such comments. It's just so ridiculous that you see stuff like that. But when I listen to you speak about some of the work, the inspiring things you guys are doing, and some of the services you provide when these things happen, it's just so uplifting to hear. So thanks for sharing that. So another aspect of your work is sort of like air quality, right? Air quality work.
Yeah.
How difficult is that type of work? Because I mean, you're talking about purifying the air, right? Like, and that sounds like a huge task.
Yeah.
How much work goes into that also?
Yeah, I would say for me, it is probably half of the work that I do for the association is focused on really this transition to cleaner technologies and cleaning the air. And I would say that, the work there is challenging because it is a balancing act between the goals and targets and the practical limitations of where we are as a society. And I mean that from a resource perspective, both financial and then, staffing, but then also to technology. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the work that I try to do on behalf of our association that we have, support from our association members on is to try to find what I could describe as a form of, practical progressivism. Yes, we want to make inroads and certainly meet the targets that were identified, but how do we identify the pathway to getting there? And so a lot of the work that we do as an organization is focused on the implementation mechanics. Now, I was having conversation with a state official just this past week where we were talking about some of the targets that are before us as a state. And we're talking about what are likely to be new targets that are placed on the industry by the state over the coming years. And I simply encouraged him that as we're having these conversations about new targets, new objectives that we want my industry to take on, that we really be thinking through the implementation mechanics of them. And I highlight that because at the end of the day, having goals or objectives that no one can meet doesn't do anyone any good. But having goals and objectives that industry and advocates support can get behind and can actually see done matters. And so a lot of the work that we do is focus on that. I'd say it's difficult work because you're balancing a variety of interests, right? You're balancing the interest of, in my case, the industry that I represent with maybe the goals, the ambitions of more progressive environmental justice groups, which we respect and we want to find common purpose with, but then also too from the state and its own objectives. Sometimes it is focused on air quality or greenhouse gas emissions, but they often will have other considerations in mind. For example, forcing technology. And by that, I mean applying technology in one sector so it can be incubated, developed, and then transferred to another. And so we try to play this chess game to find the path forward. It's difficult work, but it's, I think, ultimately the important work of making sure that, again, goals, objectives that are stipulated to actually have a means of coming to fruition.
Yeah. Difficult work. And another difficult work that you're doing right now is the rail transportation connection between San Francisco and Los Angeles. I think that's an initiative that you're currently working on. Sounds pretty huge though. So from what I'm reading, it's supposed to connect you from San Francisco to Los Angeles in a matter of 3 hours. I think it's 200 miles per hour?
Yeah, 220.
220 miles per hour. Where are we with that work, and when can people expect to see this, come alive?
Yeah, so the work is very much underway, primarily in the Central Valley, where the California HighSpeed Rail Authority, which I'll acknowledge is a former employer, but a partner in the work that we do as an association, is carrying out. They're building what is the central spine of the high-speed rail system. And the current construction work takes us from Merced to just outside of Bakersfield. That will serve as the initial test track for the high-speed rail system, where they'll be able to prove the 220-mile speeds that will be necessary to shuttle folks from San Francisco to LA in just under 3 hours. But there's also a lot of work that's underway, and this is work that I have more direct linkage to at this stage in my career, and that is investments in what they call the bookends. So there was acknowledgement that took place in the Brown administration at the time that I was there, that it would be too costly to build out dedicated infrastructure from San Francisco to LA for the high-speed rail system. But an area where they could see some cost reductions and co-benefits to other services was by advancing what they call the blended approach. And that is to say, they'll have the central spine in the Central Valley, but as they move from Merced out to the Bay Area and from Bakersfield down into the LA basin, that they would use shared infrastructure from other agencies. So for example, in the San Francisco Bay Area, that would be Caltrain. So the Caltrain electrification project that is just about to be completed and launched in this year is setting the foundation for what will be electrified high-speed rail service in the state of California. Now, I do know that the High-Speed Rail Authority just released a new business plan. Candidly, have not read it yet, so couldn't opine on their final times for delivery of the project. But I do know that the initial target had us live in the late 2020s, early 2030s to allow for that one-seat ride from San Francisco to LA. There will be intermediate service that will be afforded on the Central Valley line from Merced down to Bakersfield sooner than that.
Yeah, wow, that sounds so exciting though, and I can imagine the economic opportunities, the job opportunities that this would create. Chris, this is under 3 hours, right? And real estate is super expensive in California, and one piece of research that I came across the other day was how when you look at the wealth distribution, Black and people of the Latinx community have most of their wealth locked up in real estate. And so if we're talking about connecting people from LA to San Francisco in under 3 hours, sort of all that real estate that might be along those lines could really benefit. And hopefully people from these two communities that I've just referenced will benefit from that. And that could be huge.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for the benefits to real estate, the property values associated with the development. But I also too think that there's a lot of benefit in terms of what will be new access points for everyone who's in the Central Valley. If you live in Fresno, you live in Merced or Bakersfield or any of the cities in between, it's often a major commute to get to a major hospital that has the exact specialties and expertise that it needs to treat a very particular illness. It can be very difficult to find yourself near a UC. I'll set aside, of course, UC Merced, but if you want to go to another UC, it's a bit of a trek. And so, with this service, you're also helping to, in some ways, collapse the state and make it so that someone who's in the Central Valley can benefit from all the other opportunities and resources that exist in the state of California. Now, I had worked momentarily at the HighSpeed Rail Authority for 2 years, and was staffing the then CEO, a gentleman by the name of Jeff Morales. And when we would talk about the project and what it meant to the state of California, he would often say that it was a project that was looking to collapse space and time. And it's exactly that. When you consider that today, I leave Sacramento and I try to drive down to LA, which I actually do fairly often to visit my family, takes at least 6 hours, upwards of 8 hours, depending on traffic. To have that be cut down to less than 3 hours, and for points in between to be far less than that, really starts to open up the state. And so I think that's one of the things that when we talk about Black and brown communities who may be in parts of the Bay Area but need to get elsewhere, or the heavily Latino community that exists in the Central Valley, this is opening up wholly new sectors, experiences to them in ways that maybe would have been cost prohibitive before or time prohibitive before. And so that much matters. And it's something that I think is really compelling about the project.
Yeah, super exciting project. I can't wait to experience it. And I'm sure people that are listening are probably going to be super excited about it. Awesome. So another aspect that I was hoping to also talk about is, so we're going into an election year, and I mean, you work a lot with policy, legislature. You just mentioned you were speaking to a government official not too long ago, right? So you get to interact with some of these people. Some of us during an election year, we probably read a few things about a candidate and, we head to the ballot and then we cast our votes. From speaking to you, though, it sounds like being aware of the legislature or the policies that a candidate might be standing for is really, really important. And so what are some of the things that you're excited about and we should also know about going into this election year?
Yeah. So I think there are a number of things. And first, I'm going to start off by just making a plug that as folks are thinking about those highest offices, that you're also not ignoring what are the lower and local offices in all of your communities. The reality is that, well, certainly the president, our senators can have an impact on our lives for good or for bad. The reality is that so much of our day-to-day experiences are controlled here at the local level. City councils, boards of supervisors at the county level, the state legislature. And so everyone should be paying as much mind to those offices as they are the top of the ticket. But I think in terms of what I'm excited about, I think there's going to be significant races opened up in the California State Assembly. Given their schedules for election, every seat will be open, and there will be candidates that folks should be looking toward. What I would highlight there is that in the state of California, we've had supermajorities for Democrats in both houses. There is an opportunity to either maintain that if that's something you support, or to change that if that is something that you don't support. And so there's some good opportunities there for some significant changes in the State House. I think there's also, too, some interesting ballot propositions that will be before us. I'll flag that my association doesn't have positions on these proposals, so your acknowledgement are simply my own. But Prop 1 by Governor Newsom, looking to advance a more coherent strategy on mental health services and interactions with folks experiencing homelessness, has to be advanced. It's something that will help move the state forward in addressing what is one of the more critical challenges that we face. There's also a proposition, not yet with a number, that would look to make some changes to the California Constitution regarding investments in infrastructure, including affordable housing and transportation, whereby today, if any party were to put a measure on the ballot and say, voters, we'd like funding for this effort, they have to meet a 2/3 majority threshold in order to see that investment move forward. That's a very high bar and not something we apply in other forms of democratic actions in the state. This would reduce that threshold down to 55%. And so that means if you're a county or your city who wants to advance a new bond measure, a new sales tax measure, parcel tax measure to fund these types of critical investments, you probably will have a better chance of getting that passed. And so that's something that we're tracking on behalf of our association members, something we do think has the potential to really be a game changer in investments in affordable housing, investments in public infrastructure that mean a lot to everyday Californians.
Yeah. I love that you speak about that, though. One of the topics that you bring up is homelessness, and we're in California, and that's a huge topic right now. Is that something that you think about in your day-to-day work? Does that come up at all?
Yeah, I'd say it's a central part of our focus, particularly over these last years when the issue of homelessness on public transit has become more acute. And I think, as we observe that increase in homelessness, of course, so much of it is tied to housing unaffordability, right? So many people who were made homeless over these past few years once had some form of housing, but due to costs were maybe pushed out. And so, through the work that we do as an association, a lot of it is focused on how do we make sure that we're supporting mechanisms to help support housing development, but then also too on the homelessness front, how do we make sure that we're articulating to the state the need for them to really begin to focus on this homelessness and public transit nexus. Stepping back several years, the state has established a variety of new funding programs to support investment in homeless services, whether that's new navigation centers, support in directing folks to navigation centers or new housing. But for that money that's more about interacting with homeless individuals and providing them with support, that money all flows, as it has historically for other services in health and human services space, to the counties. And that's appropriate. At the same time, when you have agencies that are not necessarily fully affiliated with a county, here we can talk about kind of a multi-jurisdiction agency like San Francisco BART, operates throughout numerous counties in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's not a direct line for funding for those agencies to address homelessness as it is experienced on their systems. And so we've done a lot of advocacy in trying to bring that money home to the agencies. In really positioning to the state, this is an issue that's not of our creation. It's one that we want to help address and be a proactive force on that will require some additional resources. Candidly, we've not been successful at getting that direct line of infusion of funds, but we were able to support last year and actually see this bill signed into law, legislation that would require that as counties are developing their plans for how they'll address the homelessness that is experienced on their streets, how they are interacting with transit agencies to hear about their concerns, address some of their concerns, and hopefully also provide some resources for addressing homelessness on the systems. Now, I would acknowledge that doing as much, providing the support necessary for addressing homelessness in the state, of course, is something we should be doing from a moral perspective. But I would also be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge that when we talk about transit recovery, as we have from the pandemic, one of the issues that we have unfortunately heard is an impediment is at times the cleanliness of our systems. Some of that driven by the homeless population, some of it not. And so if there's work that we can do to address homelessness on our systems, we might also be able to address ridership recovery on our systems. And I want to be, respectful and delicate in this conversation, just, recognizing that at times it's not really about the actual experience so much as it is perceptions of the experience. And I would love to be able to change perceptions. We may not be able to do that absent making some changes on the ground. And so those are the types of things that we're focused on as an association, and want to make sure that as we uplift the conversation on homelessness, that we're being respectful to the fact that these are people in our society, and we've got to find a way to address the underlying issues. A lot of it comes down to housing affordability. Some of it may deal with mental health issues. Let's find ways to address those things proactively, and the rest will hopefully solve itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you sort of mentioned that, though, because you're right. Those are also people, right? They have families also. They've just ended up in that situation at the moment. And if we can, keep our public transportation safe and then also put them in a safe place so that in the long run, they can also contribute to the community, that's a win-win, right? It's Absolutely. A win-win-win because the community wins, we win, and then everybody else wins. And, that's what we're hopefully looking to get.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Michael, again, thank you so much for coming. One last topic that I want to dive into with you is leadership, because we can talk about all this amazing work that you've been doing and not talk about your leadership. You got voted, the Transportation Advocate of the Year last year. You've been voted 40 under 40, right? These are all accomplishments that don't just get handed to you. It's a testament of the work that you've done. When I met you, that day, there were so many other people that received awards also, and you were one of them. One person received like a Lifetime Achievement Award. I was like, man, you were up there with these people, right? So it's the work that you've done and the dedication that's got you to this point. What's that secret sauce that's made you super successful up to this point? If, I'm looking at you right now and I'm like, man, Michael, your accomplishments are so inspiring to me. I want to be the next Michael Pimentel, right? What is the secret sauce?
I would say it's hard work, putting in the long hours, but then also I think engaging folks with respect and humility and a willingness to hear their perspectives. The reality is, I think the success that I've had in my career derives, I think, naturally from the success that I've had in leading key initiatives. And that success is all predicated on being able to find common ground and compromise. You can't do that if you don't respect the other side, whatever that other side is, left, right, middle. It also can't be accomplished if you're not willing to actually listen to see if there is maybe a nugget of truth to what some other side or other person is saying. And so much of the work that I've done, and I think where that has translated into success, is being willing to have those conversations and to really hear people out and try to find, is there a way of finding something that is mutually beneficial for both parties or multiple parties in order to drive us forward. Yeah, I mentioned earlier that a lot of our advocacy work, I try to position as kind of practical progressivism. And it is really trying to be practical in these conversations. And so I think that's, what I would advise anyone to do is stay humble, do the hard work, listen, try to find common ground.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. And what about, I guess, like resources or books that we can reference, maybe some resources that have helped you along your journey? Maybe they continue to help you till this day that you go back to that we can also reference.
Yeah, I would say that, for me, one of the things is perhaps given the most traction in my mid to later career has been studying negotiations. Reading books like, Difficult Conversations, I think is important. And I say that because at the end of the day, most work that we do in society is some form of negotiation, some form of contract, right? Organizing this with you,
yeah,
a bit of a negotiation. Yes. Finding a new job, a negotiation. Finding housing, apartment or purchase, all a negotiation. And I think trying to understand more fully individual motivations to, again, kind of find that common ground is critical. And so that would be what I would commend to folks, study up. A number of classes you can take. I couldn't outline them for you, but would encourage you to really study that and really motivations to understand how you can find a path forward for yourself.
Yeah, amazing. Is there anything, I guess, you wanted to talk about today that maybe I haven't brought up yet that we maybe haven't talked about?
Well, Papa, I think you've covered so much ground, and it's really been a pleasure to be part of this conversation. I think the only thing that I'd bring up here is, we talked a little bit during the discussion about, workers for the industry, the importance. I just maybe want to close on that final pitch of, for your listeners who may be interested in getting to a career, looking at the public sector. It doesn't have to be public transit. I think is a good starting point for most folks. I'm no longer a public employee, but I work very closely with many public employees. And I just know how much earnest work they do, how much hard work they do, and just how critical what they do ultimately is to the communities. Not with any shade toward private sector. I'm now in the private sector, but I do think that there is a specialness that comes from that type of more on the ground experience with community members. And so just something I'd want to make a plug for.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. So one last question that we ask all of our guests that come on the podcast is, what is your definition of wealth?
I think my definition of wealth is largely derived from the maybe validation and the completeness that you can experience from a job well done. And that can be applied broadly, whether it's like in your job, in your career, or for your family or for your community. I think that's wealth. If you're able to feel like whatever you've contributed means something to others, that's true wealth. Set aside the financial aspect, which of course for many is important, myself included. But I do think that, we should have this broader definition of satisfaction, of knowing the job was well done, that we gave it our all. I think that's what it means to be wealthy.
Yeah, amazing. Michael, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Man, thank you. It's a wrap.
And now, the bonus point. As we approach the November elections, it is more critical than ever to make sure you vote. I'm not a politician, but I'm just here to encourage you to make sure you vote. Make sure you use your voice. Make sure you stand for something you believe in. And sometimes that means going to that ballot box and making sure your vote counts. That's all. Thank you for listening to this episode. As always, really appreciate your support. It means the world to me that you've listened up to this point. Peace.